Tonight, we begin the descent into one of the darkest cases I have ever opened in my career as an investigative detective. This is the beginning of a story that hides beneath the streets of Philadelphia, a story that demands patience, calm breath, and a strong heart to absorb. When I first laid my eyes upon the file, labeled Gary Michael Heidnik, I believed it would be another ordinary criminal case. A violent assault, perhaps. A disappearance. Something that had a beginning, a middle, and a clean end. I was wrong, horribly wrong. Philadelphia is a city built on history, liberty, and a belief that people can rise above their origins. Yet this same city has sheltered nightmares that grew quietly behind closed doors. In small neighborhoods, in silent streets, within homes, like the one you may pass every morning on your way to work, shadows sometimes build empires that no one can see. This is one such empire. Gary Heidnik did not fit the image of a monster. He wore clean shirts and kept his house in order. He was polite when he spoke, quiet in public, and invisible in crowds. But the first rule I learned as a detective still applies here. Evil does not need to announce itself. It knows how to blend in. It knows how to smile. And most importantly, it knows how to wait. Heidnik's childhood was not the root of his crimes, but it was the soil that nourished them. Born in 1943, he grew up under the harsh discipline of a father who believed cruelty was a form of teaching. His mother left early, leaving him in a world of empty rooms and louder punishments. A child who grows up unloved may become a warrior, but a child who grows up broken may become something else entirely. In school, he excelled academically. Teachers saw intelligence and potential. Students saw an outsider, rigid and cold. Heidnik rarely looked people in the eye. He spoke as if emotions were foreign to him. As he grew older, this absence of empathy did not fade. It solidified. He attempted to build a future through the military, a structure he believed would give him purpose. But the Army soon discovered the fractures in his mind, strange behaviors, emotional instability, hallucinations. He was discharged, sent back into society with a diagnosis that should have kept him under watch. Yet he slipped through the cracks. He moved freely into the world without any real supervision, without any guardrails. The man who would one day build a dungeon beneath his home returned to Philadelphia, reinventing himself as an investor. Surprisingly, he excelled. He made money, a lot of money. Enough to give him the independence and privacy he needed to hide something unthinkable. Money became his armor, shielding him from suspicion. No one questions a quiet man with a fat bank account. But what truly set the foundation for his crimes was his creation of a small religious organization. He called it the United Church of the Ministers of God. To outsiders, it sounded eccentric but harmless, the kind of self-made church that emerges from time to time in American cities. In reality, it was a legal aid that let him move money and justify odd behavior without alarm. Yet even then, the darkness inside him had not fully awakened. The shift began around the early 1980s, when his fantasies grew more structured. He started believing he was chosen by God to create a new race. A race built from women he would capture, control, and breed. His distorted theology was not the wild rambling of a street prophet. It was carefully thought out. He wrote notes, he planned, he prepared. By 1986, the plan had transformed into action. Philadelphia's poorer neighborhoods became his hunting ground. These were areas filled with people who lived unnoticed, whose disappearances rarely made headlines. Women who struggled with poverty, unstable housing, or social margins. These were the ones Heidnik believed he could make vanish without consequence. He approached them with politeness, sometimes with money, sometimes with food, sometimes simply with the illusion of safety. He lured them one by one to his home on North Marshall Street, and once they stepped through the door, the lock behind them was the last real sound of freedom they would ever hear. The first victim vanished quietly. Then the second. Soon he had turned his basement into the center of his twisted mission. The walls of that basement would absorb screams no neighbor could fully identify. The floor would bear marks that would later haunt every detective who walked through that room. What happened inside would ignite the first embers of horror that the city had never seen coming. When investigators study the path of a predator, we often look for a trigger, something that pushes a man from grotesque fantasy into brutal reality. In the case of Gary Heidnik, the transition is not marked by a sudden explosion of violence. It is marked by a quiet decision, a choice so calm and intentional that it chills the spine more than any impulsive act ever could. By early 1986, Heidnik had convinced himself that he needed to take women from the streets of Philadelphia in order to create what he called his perfect family. He believed obedience was the highest virtue and fear was the strongest tool to achieve it. He did not want partners. He did not want companionship. He wanted ownership. When darkness takes the shape of possession, it stops being a shadow and becomes a structure. That structure was built in his basement. The first woman he abducted had disappeared into the kind of silence that troubled no one. It is one of the tragedies of this case that the world barely noticed. Poverty can be a cloak that hides suffering. Social invisibility can be more dangerous than any weapon in the hands of a predator, and Heidnik understood this. He used this. He chose victims the world had refused to see. But the second abduction marked a shift. His methods grew more organized, more controlled. He had purchased chains. He had installed bolts into the walls. He had prepared food supplies, clothing, and restraints. What he wanted was not chaos, but stability within his warped design. The women he captured were meant to be the foundation of a twisted plan that no rational mind could justify. When the second woman awoke in his basement, she found herself chained to a pipe near the corner of the concrete floor. The light bulbs above her flickered. The smell of dampness clung to the air. There was no bed, no chair, only the cold ground beneath her back. She had no understanding of why she was chosen or what would happen next. Heidnik rarely spoke to his captives, but when he did, his words were cold and calculated. He explained that they would stay until he said otherwise, that they were part of something necessary, something he believed God wanted. There are moments in criminal investigation that stay with us for the rest of our lives. And when I reviewed the surviving victims' statements, the detail that struck me most was their silence. Not their screams, their silence. The silence of trying to understand a man who did not react to pain or fear, a man who watched suffering as though it were a puzzle he was trying to solve. As weeks passed, more women were taken. One by one, they woke in the darkness of the basement, hearing the rattling of chains already holding others. Some tried to fight, some begged, some prayed, but control was the axis on which Heidnik rotated his entire world. He fed them irregularly, maintaining their weakness. He punished them when they resisted. He used isolation as a weapon. He separated those who disobeyed, forcing them into the darkest corner of the basement where they could not hear the voices of the others. He wanted to break their individual identities, then rebuild them into what he believed they should be. The basement was not just a prison. It was a system. The concrete floor bore the weight of every moment of suffering. The walls, cold and sweating with moisture, trapped the sound. Above them, the rest of the city went on with its life. Cars passed, radios played, people cooked dinners. No one knew that just beneath their feet existed a chamber built by a man who walked among them unnoticed. Heidnik kept a routine. He would leave the house for hours at a time, often to meet people who believed he was simply an eccentric loner with money. These were the same hours when the captives remained trapped, chained in the dark, with no idea whether he would return that night or the next morning. The unpredictability was part of his design. The uncertainty was a cage inside a cage. He experimented with methods to control them. Sometimes he used food as reward, sometimes as punishment. He manipulated their bonds with one another, convincing some that obedience would earn freedom. He created competition between them to erode trust. Over time, survival instinct replaced hope. They learned not to cry loudly. They learned not to plead. They learned to conserve their strength. Trauma became routine. But the most disturbing element in this phase of the case is the transformation of the basement itself. As more captives were added, the space felt tighter, heavier. The air grew warmer from body heat. But the psychological weight was far worse. Some women later described the basement as feeling alive, as if the fear held in that small concrete room had grown into an invisible presence that watched them. Heidnik's behavior outside the house remained completely undetected. He went to restaurants, he banked his money, he wrote letters, he even greeted neighbors. All the while, he was hiding an atrocity beneath his own floors. It is always haunting to realize how seamlessly someone can blend into normal life while committing horrors just a few feet away from the living room where he watched television. The breaking point for the captives came when one woman, weakened from malnutrition and repeated abuse, stopped responding. Her breathing slowed, her strength dropped. In most stories of captivity, the captor panics at this stage. Not Heidnik. He saw her condition as an inconvenience, not a tragedy. What he did next created a permanent scar on the psychological landscape of the surviving victims. Her death was not simply a moment of loss. It was a moment of terror for everyone else chained in that room. They had seen a woman fade away. They had heard her final breaths. And now they knew something that changed everything. Escape was not an option. Death was the only exit Heidnik allowed. This moment is where the case darkens even further, because his response to her death was something no human mind should ever accept as rational. His behavior crossed from brutality into a realm that investigators struggle to describe even in official reports. It was not insanity, it was intention. Cold, structured intention. And the women who remained alive realized they were not just captives. They were living within a nightmare created by a man who believed he was untouchable. They understood that every second was a calculation, every breath was borrowed. Survival depended on understanding a predator who did not think like a human being. It is at this point in the investigation where the basement stops being a crime scene and becomes a psychological war zone. The captives were fighting for their minds just as much as their bodies, and every day they remained alive. They witnessed more of the darkness taking shape. What they did not know was that one of them, just one, would gather enough courage, timing, and sheer desperation to challenge the structure he had built. Her escape would break open the doors of the house on Marshall Street, and her courage would expose the truth of what lay beneath. But before that escape, the nightmare had to reach its peak. There is a stage in every nightmare where the darkness becomes so thick that the human mind begins to change shape. In the basement on North Marshall Street, That transformation happened slowly, silently, and with a cruelty that only time can sharpen. For the women trapped beneath Gary Heidnik's home, survival became less a task of holding on and more an act of reshaping themselves around terror. It is in this stage of the story where the mind becomes the battlefield. When I reviewed the testimonies of the surviving victims, I noticed something striking. Their memories of the basement were not linear. They did not remember events in a clean, organized timeline. Instead, they remembered sensations. The cold of the concrete floor against their skin, the metallic taste of fear, the faint buzz of the single flickering light bulb above them, the smell of dampness that clung to their lungs. Trauma does not record moments. It records fragments. And those fragments became the language through which they described their ordeal. By late 1986, the number of captives in Heidnik's basement had grown. The room, once empty and echoing, was now occupied by weakened bodies huddled together for warmth. Their breathing filled the tight air. Their whispers replaced silence. Their hunger made their hands shake. When one cried, the others tried not to. Hope, at this stage, was a fragile thread that few dared to hold on to. One of the women later described the basement as a place where time stopped. She said she no longer knew if it was morning or night. She only knew the rhythm of Heidnik's footsteps. When he descended the stairs, her pulse quickened, her breath tightened, and every muscle in her body braced for whatever he decided to do. Whether he arrived with food or punishment, his presence always meant danger. He was the permanent storm hovering above them, but even storms have patterns, and the women began to observe him. They watched his habits. They memorized his reactions. They deciphered the strange logic of a man who believed he was chosen by God to control them. In this observation, they found a small, faint weapon. If they could predict him, even slightly, they could survive a little longer. Heidnik, in his twisted mind, believed he was building a family. But everything he did only destroyed the idea of family. He fed them erratically. Some days he gave them bread soaked in water. Other days he tossed scraps onto the floor, like feeding animals. He punished any sign of disobedience with beatings. Sometimes he deprived them of food entirely. Sometimes he chained them in uncomfortable positions for hours. These were not acts of rage. They were strategies designed to break their will. The women learned to adapt. They learned to speak softly to avoid irritating him. They learned to move slowly so chains would not rattle. They learned to read every tiny shift in his expression. They learned, in a sense, to disappear while still breathing. But the human body has limits. And one night, another captive fell unconscious, weak, starving, and unable to stand. She collapsed in the far corner of the basement. The survivors later said her breathing sounded like a candle flickering in the wind. They tried to help her, whispering her name, touching her hand, but nothing revived her. When Heidnik returned and discovered her condition, his reaction chilled every soul in that room. He did not shout. He did not panic. He barely blinked. He simply looked at her with the blankness of someone staring at an object that had stopped working. This was the moment when the psychological terror of the basement escalated beyond comprehension. The women understood that to Heidnik, life and death were interchangeable. They were components of a plan, not human beings. And what he did next scarred their minds forever. He removed her lifeless body from the basement. The sound of his footsteps, dragging her up the stairs, echoed like a verdict. The door closed behind him. Hours passed. The women sat in silence, holding their breath, gripping each other's hands in the dark. They did not know what he was doing. They only knew the smell changed. It grew thicker. It clung to their skin. It made their stomachs twist. Fear and nausea mixed into one unbearable sensation. When he finally returned, his hands were stained. His clothes were stained. His eyes were calm. He moved around the room with the casualness of a man adjusting furniture. The remaining women tried not to look at him, but one of them, trembling, looked up at his face and realized something terrifying. He felt nothing, not guilt, not panic, not anger, nothing at all. The transformation of the basement was complete. It was no longer a holding space. It was a machine built from cruelty, designed to dismantle the minds of the living. But even in that machinery, survival instincts flickered. The women began forming silent agreements, tiny alliances built on the smallest fragments of trust. They learned to signal to one another without speaking. A slight nod meant danger. A quick glance toward the stairs meant he was coming. A shift in position meant someone needed help. They shared what little food they were given. They whispered encouragement in the moments before punishment. They held each other when fear became too heavy to bear. In that basement of horrors, the most powerful act was not resistance. It was compassion. Their unity became a form of rebellion Heidnik could not destroy. And in the midst of this, something else happened. One woman, later known as the key to breaking the case, began studying everything more intensely. She watched the door. She counted his footsteps. She listened to the locks. She memorized the timing of his outings. She observed the smallest moments of hesitation in his behavior. She was waiting for the single flaw in the structure, waiting for the one moment where control loosened, waiting for the smallest opportunity to run. The horror in that basement had reached its peak. The women lived in a fragile balance between obedience and desperation. Their bodies were weakening, their minds were fraying, but their instinct to survive remained a fire that refused to die, and that fire would soon ignite. There comes a moment in every crime story when the walls of silence begin to crack. In most cases, it comes from a mistake made by the criminal. But in rare, extraordinary cases, it comes from the courage of someone who has been pushed past the limits of human suffering. In the basement beneath 3520 North Marshall Street, that moment arrived quietly, cautiously, and with the kind of bravery that only desperation can shape. The woman who would one day break the case open was not the strongest in the room. She was not the loudest. She did not fight Heidnik with fists or screams. Her resistance was quieter, internal, built from long hours of observing every detail around her. She studied the way he unlocked the door. She memorized the rhythm of his footsteps. She counted the number of steps between the kitchen and the basement entrance. She watched how he reacted to noise, how long he stayed away when he left the house, and what times of day he seemed most distracted. She learned his habits, the way one learns the behavior of a dangerous animal. Every detail mattered. Every observation could become the key to survival. By early 1987, the conditions in the basement reached a level of cruelty that defies explanation. The women were growing weaker. Their voices were softer. Their bodies bore marks that could never fully fade. Some could no longer stand. Some whispered prayers through trembling lips. The basement air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and something darker that lived under the skin. The city above them kept moving, unaware that beneath its streets a nightmare was unfolding. What Heidnik did not realize was that his control was beginning to fracture. The human spirit, even when bent, does not break easily. And within that dank, shadowed room, something was changing. The captives had begun to trust one another, forming an unspoken alliance. Their bond was not built from strength, but from the frail hope that one of them might escape and bring help. The idea of freedom became the oxygen they shared, The turning point came after a long night in which Heidnik returned in an agitated state. No one knew what triggered his anger that evening, but the violence he unleashed left several victims bruised and bleeding. He shouted to himself. He spoke to voices only he could hear. He paced the basement like a man trapped inside his own delusions. The captives watched him carefully, realizing his instability was reaching a pinnacle. But that night also revealed something important. He made a mistake. In the chaos of his anger, he forgot to secure one of the chains properly. And one woman noticed. She said nothing. She did nothing to draw attention, but in that moment she understood that fate had opened a single, narrow door. The days that followed were tense. She waited for the moment when he would leave the house long enough for her to act. She rehearsed her escape silently in her mind. She practiced the angle at which she could slip her wrist through the loose metal cuff. She timed the creaking of the steps to predict when he was out of earshot. The other women watched her with a mixture of hope and fear. They knew that if she ran, their chances of rescue increased, but they also knew that if she failed, the punishment would be catastrophic for all of them. One morning, after feeding them a small portion of food, Heidnik left the basement and slammed the door shut. They heard his footsteps on the floor above. They heard the front door open. Then, for the first time in days, they heard silence. Not the heavy silence of fear, but the open silence of opportunity. The woman breathed slowly, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. She pulled at the loose restraint. It slid enough for her hand to twist. She winced from the pain as the metal scraped her skin, but she did not stop. She pulled harder. The cuff loosened. Her wrist slipped free. For the first time since her capture, her hand touched the air as a free limb. She looked at the other women, tears forming in their eyes. They nodded. Silent encouragement, silent desperation. She stood on trembling legs. The basement felt unfamiliar at that angle. She climbed the stairs, pushing her weight against each step. Her breath tightened. Every creak felt like the end. At the door, she tried the knob. It turned. He had forgotten to lock it. She stepped into the kitchen. The smell of the upstairs, air cleaner and sharper, almost overwhelmed her. She walked to the front door, her vision blurred. The world outside was so bright it burned her eyes. She pushed the door open. Cold air hit her face, and she ran barefoot. Half-dressed, skin bruised, wrists raw and bleeding. But she ran with the force of every soul still chained below the house. She flagged down a passing driver. She screamed for help. People saw her scars. They saw the terror on her face. Someone called the police. Officers arrived within minutes, and in that moment, the silence of 3520 North Marshall Street shattered. When the police entered the house, they moved cautiously. The smell hit them first, the sound next, faint movements, faint breaths. The officers descended the basement stairs with flashlights raised. What they found was a scene that would haunt them for decades. Women chained, women trembling. Women starved, injured, desperate. The basement that had been hidden beneath a quiet neighborhood home now revealed its truth. It was a chamber of horror, built by a man who had lived among them, unnoticed. The surviving victims looked at the officers with a mix of relief and disbelief. They were finally seen, finally heard, finally free. Gary Heidnik was arrested within hours. He did not resist. He did not plead. He did not attempt to explain. When officers handcuffed him, his expression remained eerily calm, as though the collapse of his hidden kingdom meant nothing. But for the women he left behind, the nightmare was only beginning to unravel. There were questions to answer, wounds to describe, memories to relive, and a justice system that had to face the truth that it had failed to see them. In every investigation, there is a day when the truth is no longer hidden in shadows or buried beneath silence. For the case of Gary Heidnik, that day arrived with the force of a tidal wave. The escape of one brave woman had cracked the darkness open, but what followed would expose every secret lurking inside the walls of 3520 North Marshall Street. And as the world began to see the truth, the weight of the case shifted from survival to justice. When officers first stood inside the basement, flashlights trembling in their hands, they were not just looking at crime. They were looking at the aftermath of unchecked evil. The women stared back at them with hollow eyes, eyes that held stories too painful to speak. Some reached out their hands, barely able to stand. Others cried without sound, their voices broken from weeks of screaming into a void. Their bodies were fragile, but the fact that they were alive at all was a testament to a strength far beyond anything most people will ever understand. The rescue operation was delicate. Some women had to be carried out. Others clung to the arms of officers as if touching another human being for the first time in months. Paramedics rushed into the home, bringing stretchers, oxygen masks, blankets. The house that once functioned as a fortress of terror was now a flood of flashing lights, urgent voices, radio calls, and footsteps moving quickly through the hallways. One of the officers later told me that when he left the house that day, he stepped outside and vomited behind a police car. Not because of the physical horror he witnessed, but because he realized how long those women had been calling for help while the world above them remained silent. In the hours following the rescue, the investigation expanded with a momentum that felt unstoppable. Detectives photographed every inch of the basement. They collected evidence, chains, restraints, food containers, clothing fragments, handwritten notes. The air inside the house grew thick with the heat of equipment and the tension of agents who knew they were uncovering something the city would never forget. When Gary Heidnik was interrogated, he remained chillingly calm. He answered questions with short, flat statements. He denied nothing, admitted nothing, explained nothing. It was as if he existed in a separate reality, one where morality meant nothing and logic followed a twisted, private set of rules. A psychologist who evaluated him described his mind as a maze with walls made of glass, easy to see through, impossible to navigate. But the evidence did not need his cooperation. The victims' testimonies painted the truth with clarity sharper than any confession. They described the days and nights in the basement. They described the starvation, the beatings, the punishments. They described the death of the woman whose body had been taken upstairs and never returned. They described the terror that lived in that room like a ghost. Their words, though soft, carried the weight of undeniable truth. The trial began in 1988. The courtroom filled with reporters, photographers, and citizens who wanted to witness the reckoning of a man who had hidden his crimes in plain sight. The survivors sat together, supporting one another. Some trembled when they took the stand. Some paused to breathe through memories that resurfaced like open wounds. But each woman spoke with courage that resonated in every corner of the courtroom. When the prosecution presented the evidence, the room fell into a heavy, stunned silence. Photos of the basement, medical reports, diagrams of restraints, expert testimony. Every piece added to a picture of cruelty so calculated that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. Heidnik's attorneys attempted to argue insanity, claiming he was too mentally ill to understand the consequences of his actions. But the prosecution countered with a devastating truth. He had planned every detail. He had purchased materials, constructed restraints, manipulated victims, hidden evidence, and maintained a facade of normalcy in public. His actions were not the result of an uncontrolled mind. They were the product of deliberate, systematic choices. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was silent. The words echoed with the clarity of justice finally speaking. Guilty on all charges. And with that verdict came the sentence. Death Gary Heidnik was sent to death row, where he continued to exist in the same eerie detachment he displayed throughout the trial. He never apologized, never expressed remorse, never acknowledged the suffering he caused. For years, he filed appeals, insisting he was sane, then insane, then mistreated by the system. But nothing could change the outcome he had carved with his own hands. In 1999, 12 years after his arrest, Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection. Witnesses described his final moments as silent and expressionless. A man who had built an empire of nightmares left the world as quietly as he had lived within it. But the end of his life was not the end of the story. The true final chapter belongs to the women who survived. They rebuilt their lives with a strength that inspires anyone who learns their names. Some returned to their families. Some moved far away seeking new beginnings. Some continued therapy for years. Their pain did not vanish, but they refused to let it define them. They endured what few could imagine, and they rose above it. And then there is the final lesson of the case, one that echoes in every detective's mind who has studied it. The world often looks for monsters in the shadows, but sometimes monsters live next door. They smile politely, they attend church, they run errands, they wave to neighbors, they appear ordinary. The truth is that evil does not always look like evil. As I close the file on the case of Gary Heidnik, I think about the house that once stood on North Marshall Street. The basement has been emptied. The walls have been painted. The property changed hands. Life continues. The street is quiet again, but beneath the pavement, in the memory of the city, the echo of what happened there will never be fully erased. Some stories do not end. They settle into the conscience of the world like a scar. This is one of them.